November 1990. A young police officer named Igor Rybakov was patrolling near a forest strip close to the Donleskaz train station in Rostov Oblast. It was a routine assignment, part of an intensified surveillance operation that had turned the region into something resembling a police state. For years, bodies had been turning up in these woods, mutilated, dismembered, bearing signs of unimaginable violence. That day, Rybakov noticed a middle-aged man emerging from the forest path. There was something off about him: mud on his coat, a small cut on his finger, and most disturbingly, what appeared to be grass and leaves stuck to his clothes, as if he'd been rolling on the ground. The man wore glasses, carried a briefcase, and looked like any other Soviet citizen heading home from work. But this was a high-alert zone, and Rybakov stopped him. The man's name was Andrei Chikatilo. He was 54 years old, a former teacher, now working as a supply clerk. He seemed nervous but cooperative, showing his identification papers. Rybakov wrote down his details and let him go. What the young officer didn't know was that just meters away, in those very woods, lay the body of Svetlana Korostik, Chikatilo's 52nd and final victim. And what no one knew yet was that this routine stop would finally end a 12-year nightmare that had paralyzed southern Russia. The irony of Chikatilo's arrest is that it wasn't his first encounter with Soviet law enforcement. In fact, the system had held the killer in its hands before, and let him slip away. September 1984. Detective Aleksandr Zanasovski was monitoring suspicious individuals at the Rostov bus station, a known hunting ground for the killer. He spotted a man behaving strangely, approaching young women and girls, trying to engage them in conversation, being repeatedly rejected. When the man moved to a nearby bar, Zanasovski followed. Inside the man's bag, a knife, a length of rope, a jar of lubricant, and a dirty towel. This was Andrei Chikatilo, and he was arrested on the spot. The police had their man, or so they thought. But there was a problem. A critical, devastating problem that would haunt the investigation for 6 more years and cost at least 15 more lives. Blood found at crime scenes indicated the killer had type AB blood, rare, found in only 6% of the population. Chikatilo's blood was type A. It seemed impossible that he could be the killer. What Soviet forensic science didn't understand in 1984 was a rare biological phenomenon. Chikatilo was a non-secretor, someone whose blood type in other bodily fluids differs from their actual blood type. This genetic quirk, present in only 20% of the population, gave him a biological alibi. Chikatilo was held for 3 months on minor charges, theft of state property related to his job, then released. The real killer, authorities believed, was still out there. By 1983, Soviet authorities could no longer deny the pattern. Bodies were accumulating: children, teenagers, young women, prostitutes, homeless men. The wounds were horrific: multiple stab wounds, eyes gouged out, sexual organs removed, bite marks covering the bodies. Some victims had been partially cannibalized. But there was a problem beyond the forensic challenges: ideology. In Soviet doctrine, serial murder was a disease of capitalist decadence. It couldn't happen in the workers' paradise. When Western journalists asked about reports of a serial killer in Rostov, Soviet officials flatly denied his existence. Behind closed doors, however, panic was setting in. A massive task force was assembled, over 300 officers at its peak. Leading the investigation was Viktor Burakov, a detective who would become obsessed with the case, sacrificing his health and nearly his sanity to catch the killer. But Burakov faced obstacles that would be unthinkable to Western investigators. The Soviet Union had no centralized criminal database. Different regions didn't share information effectively. When Chikatilo killed in Ukraine or Uzbekistan during work trips, those murders weren't immediately connected to the Rostov cases. The police had to work with paper files, manually cross-referencing thousands of documents. Even more bizarrely, political interference constantly derailed the investigation. At various points, authorities arrested and tortured mentally disabled individuals, homosexuals, and other undesirables to close cases. Several innocent men were executed for murders Chikatilo had committed. The pressure to solve the case led to desperate, tragic mistakes. In 1984, frustrated with conventional methods, Burakov took an unprecedented step. He consulted with Dr. Aleksandr Bukhanovsky, a psychiatrist from Rostov. This was revolutionary. Soviet psychiatry didn't acknowledge the concept of serial killers, and criminal profiling was virtually unknown in the USSR. Bukhanovsky worked with Burakov to create a psychological portrait of the killer, a man in his 40s or 50s, likely with sexual dysfunction, probably married with children to maintain a normal appearance, someone who had suffered humiliation and developed a deep hatred toward those he perceived as weak. The killer, Bukhanovsky theorized, achieved sexual satisfaction only through violence and blood. He would appear ordinary, even meek, the type of man who could move through society without raising suspicion. The profile was eerily accurate. But knowing who you're looking for and finding them in a country of 280 million people are very different challenges. After 1984, Chikatilo went quiet for almost 3 years, his longest period of inactivity. Some investigators believed he had died or been imprisoned for another crime. But in 1985, he killed again. And again. And again. The task force implemented Operation Forest Strip, an intensive surveillance operation focusing on train stations, bus stops, and the forest areas where bodies were found. Undercover officers posed as travelers, prostitutes, and vagrants. Every suspicious person was documented. It was during one of these operations that Chikatilo was stopped in 1985, and again in 1987. Each time, he had explanations that seemed plausible enough. He was checked against the database but never held for long. Meanwhile, Chikatilo was becoming more brazen. He killed in areas under active surveillance, sometimes returning to dump sites where he had killed before. It was as if he believed he was invincible, protected by some dark force that kept him just out of reach. The investigation consumed massive resources. At various points, over 24,000 people were questioned. More than 150 mentally ill individuals were detained and investigated. The woods were searched repeatedly, with police literally walking shoulder to shoulder through kilometers of forest. The case files eventually filled an entire room. After his arrest in November 1990, Chikatilo was placed in a cell at Rostov police headquarters. For days, he denied everything. Burakov and his team threw everything at him: evidence, accusations, psychological pressure. Nothing worked. Then Burakov made a calculated decision. He brought in Dr. Bukhanovsky, the psychiatrist who had profiled the killer 6 years earlier. Bukhanovsky spent hours with Chikatilo, not as an interrogator but as a doctor. He read his profile aloud, describing in clinical detail the psychology of the man sitting across from him. Something broke. Chikatilo began to talk. And once he started, he couldn't stop. The confession was chilling in its detail. Chikatilo described each murder with disturbing precision, where he met his victims, how he lured them, what he did to them. He demonstrated with hand gestures how he stabbed them, where he bit them, which organs he removed. He spoke of the sexual release he felt as his victims died, something his impotence prevented him from experiencing any other way. He confessed to 56 murders. The police could prove 52 of them, bodies had been found, evidence matched his descriptions. But there were 4 victims whose bodies were never recovered, for families who would never know for certain what happened to their children. As details emerged, a portrait formed of Andrei Chikatilo's life, a study in dysfunction and failure wrapped in Soviet normality. Born in 1936 in Ukraine during the Holodomor famine, Chikatilo grew up hearing stories of cannibalism and death. His mother told him his older brother had been kidnapped and eaten by starving neighbors, a story that may or may not have been true but haunted him throughout his life. He was a weak child, constantly bullied, suffering from bedwetting into his teens. He developed severe myopia but was too ashamed to wear glasses. In adolescence, his impotence became apparent, a source of profound shame in Soviet culture where masculinity was prized. He became a teacher, a position of trust and authority, but was dismissed from multiple schools for molesting students. Each time, he found another job. The Soviet bureaucracy, with its emphasis on full employment and rehabilitation, kept giving him chances. And each chance put him in contact with potential victims. He married, had 2 children, and maintained the facade of a normal Soviet family man. His wife later claimed she never suspected anything, though she knew about his sexual problems. His children remembered him as strict but not abusive. Neighbors described him as quiet, unremarkable, the kind of man you'd pass on the street and immediately forget. The trial began in April 1992, held in a specially modified courtroom. Chikatilo sat in a large metal cage, partly for his protection, as relatives of victims had threatened to kill him, and partly for dramatic effect. Soviet justice was making a statement. The proceedings were chaotic. Chikatilo alternated between coherent testimony and bizarre outbursts. He would strip naked, wave his penis at the court, and shout about being a pathological homosexual, about communist conspiracies, about radiation poisoning. He claimed he was a scientific experiment gone wrong, that he had been driven insane by childhood trauma. His lawyers argued insanity. How could anyone sane commit such atrocities? But Soviet psychiatrists, who had evaluated him extensively, declared him legally sane. He knew what he was doing was wrong. He had hidden the bodies, cleaned up crime scenes, avoided capture for 12 years. A truly insane person couldn't maintain such calculated behavior. On October 15, 1992, Chikatilo was found guilty of 52 murders and sentenced to death for each count. As the judge read the sentence, relatives of victims wept, screamed, some collapsed. Chikatilo stood silently in his cage, occasionally smiling. He was executed on February 14, 1994, Valentine's Day, with a single bullet to the back of the head in a soundproof room at a Russian prison. His body was cremated, his ashes scattered. It was over. The Chikatilo case exposed fundamental flaws in Soviet society and law enforcement. The ideological refusal to acknowledge serial killers delayed the investigation by years. The lack of modern forensic technology and centralized databases allowed him to kill across regions with impunity. The pressure to solve cases led to false confessions and wrongful executions. But it also led to reforms. The case prompted the development of criminal profiling in Russia, better inter-regional cooperation, and improved forensic techniques. Dr. Bukhanovsky's work became the foundation for Soviet and later Russian criminal psychology. For Viktor Burakov, the detective who spent 8 years hunting Chikatilo, the case was both a triumph and a tragedy. He had caught his killer, but at tremendous personal cost. He suffered a nervous breakdown shortly after the arrest, haunted by the victims he couldn't save and the mistakes that had let Chikatilo kill for so long. The woods outside Rostov are quiet now. But the families of 52 victims still carry their grief. Children who never came home, mothers who disappeared walking to the store, teenagers who accepted a piece of gum from a friendly stranger, each one a life destroyed, a future erased. And somewhere in those woods, perhaps never to be found, lie 4 more victims, known only to the killer who took their lives and the darkness that witnessed their final moments. The story of Andrei Chikatilo is more than a true crime tale. It's a window into how systems can fail, how ideology can blind, and how evil can hide in plain sight. A former teacher, a Communist Party member, a seemingly ordinary man who lived next door, he passed through life almost invisibly while leaving a trail of blood. The investigation that caught him was a masterpiece of persistence against impossible odds. Detectives who refused to give up despite political pressure, a psychiatrist who pioneered new techniques, and ultimately, a young patrol officer who noticed something off about a man emerging from the woods. Today, Chikatilo's name lives in infamy as one of history's most prolific serial killers. But the real story isn't about him, it's about the victims who deserved better, the investigators who wouldn't quit, and the lessons learned from one of the darkest chapters in Soviet criminal history.